The train from Caldwell reached Sutter's Bend 40 minutes ahead of schedule, which was unusual enough that the station master stepped outside twice to confirm it with his own eyes. By the time the passengers descended onto the platform, word had already moved up the main street the way word moves in a town of 400 people, not through any particular effort, but through the simple fact that not much else was happening on a Tuesday in October. There were 3 passengers. 2 of them were expected. The third was not. She stepped down last. She was dressed in traveling clothes, plain and well kept. A gray coat with a small valise in one hand and nothing else. She was not the kind of woman who looked lost, even in an unfamiliar place. She stood on the platform and looked at the street the way a person looks at something they have already made a decision about and are simply confirming the details of. She asked the station master one question: "Is there a man named Callum Greer in this town?" The station master looked at her the way people in Sutter's Bend looked at anyone who said that name with the particular directness she had just used. A brief, involuntary pause. The kind that checks whether the speaker understands the weight of what they're carrying. "There is," he said carefully. "Then I'm in the right place," she said, and picked up her valise. Her name was Nora Ashfield, or rather, it had been. The paper folded inside her coat pocket said otherwise now, and had said so for 11 days. Long enough to feel real. Not quite long enough to feel entirely like hers. She had written the first letter in February, at a kitchen table that was no longer hers to sit at, in a house that had made its feelings about her continued presence quietly but unmistakably clear. Her sister's house, her sister's patience, both running low. The advertisement had been practical in its language, which she had appreciated. No flourishes. No promises dressed up as certainties. A man in the northern counties seeking a wife of capable character for the management of a working property. Honest work, stable situation. References available, she had written back in kind. 3 letters had passed between them before anything resembling a real exchange had occurred. The 4th was when she had stopped being careful and simply told the truth. That she had been a schoolteacher for 6 years in a town that had recently hired someone younger. That she had been briefly and unhappily engaged to a man whose family had eventually made the decision easier than she had. That she was not sentimental about her circumstances, but she was also not without standards. Callum Greer had written back 2 days later. His letter was 4 paragraphs. The first described the property. The second described what he needed from a practical partner. The third was about the town, its size, its character, what she should expect. The 4th was short. "I will not pretend I am easy to live with. I will tell you plainly when something is wrong and expect the same in return. If that is acceptable to you, then the rest can be managed." She had read that paragraph 4 times. Then she had written back and said yes. The courthouse in the county seat was a 2-hour ride from Sutter's Bend. They had met there on a Wednesday morning. Signed what needed signing in front of a clerk who had the look of a man who had seen stranger things, and shaken hands afterward on the steps outside. He was not what she had pictured, though she had been careful not to picture much. He was taller than she had imagined, with a weathered face and the particular economy of movement that comes from years of solitary labor. He was somewhere past 40. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. He looked at her with an attention that was neither warm nor unkind, simply direct, as though he was trying to form an accurate accounting. "The train from Caldwell stops at Sutter's Bend," he had said. "I'll arrange for your trunk to be brought out." "I travel light," she had told him. He had nodded as though that settled something. Then he had gone to get the wagon, and she had stood on the courthouse steps and thought, well, that's that, then. He had come back with the wagon. She had climbed up without waiting to be helped. He had said nothing about that, which she appreciated more than she expected to. The property was 3 miles east of town on a stretch of land that had been worked hard and looked at, not in a neglected way, but in the way of a place that had been asked to produce and had been doing so without complaint. The fields were cleared. The fences were mended. The outbuildings were sound. The house itself was larger than she had expected. 2 stories, with a deep porch along the front and windows that let in the afternoon light on the western side. Functional, solid. The kind of place built by someone who thought in decades rather than seasons. He had shown her the house without ceremony. Where the pump was. How the stove drew. The small room off the kitchen that could serve as a study if she wanted it. The upstairs room that was hers, with a window that looked out over the east field. "It's quiet at night," he had said. "Some people find that difficult." "I'll manage," she had said. He had left her to settle in and gone back to the barn. And she had stood in the middle of her room with her valise at her feet and looked out the window at the October fields and thought about the particular quality of choices made without the luxury of better options. Then she had unpacked her valise, made a note of what the house needed, and gone downstairs to start supper. The town found out, as towns do. Through a combination of the unavoidable and the inevitable, the station master mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to the woman who ran the dry goods counter at the general store. The woman at the dry goods counter had 3 conversations before noon. By evening, the broad shape of the situation had been assembled from its pieces, passed around, examined from several angles, and distributed with the particular efficiency of a community that took its information seriously. Callum Greer had married. Nobody had been informed. Nobody had been invited. The woman had arrived on the Tuesday train with 1 bag, and the look of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The general opinion, formed quickly over supper tables across Sutter's Bend, was that this required explanation. The minority opinion, offered by a woman named Mrs. Harda, who had known Callum Greer longer than most and had opinions about most things that turned out to be correct, was that Callum Greer had never offered explanations for anything in 11 years, and there was no particular reason to expect he would start now. "But what kind of woman," said the butcher's wife, "arrives in a strange town as a strange man's wife without so much as a word beforehand?" "The kind who has her reasons," said Mrs. Hardy, and went back to her tea. Nora had her reasons. She did not offer them to anyone, because no one asked her directly in those first days, and she was not in the habit of explaining herself to people who were watching her from across streets and through windows instead of coming to the door. She went into town on the Thursday alone, with a list she had made the night before. She needed thread. She needed 2 specific things from the apothecary. She wanted to identify the library, if there was one, and to understand the general layout of the place she now lived in. She moved through the main street with the quiet efficiency of a woman on a practical errand and noticed without reacting to it that she was being observed with a thoroughness that she had not encountered since being the new teacher in Belfield 6 years ago. At the general store, the woman behind the counter, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Pryor, made 3 attempts at conversation that were really attempts at information. Nora answered each one with the accurate minimum. Yes, she had come from the south. No, she did not know anyone in the area previously. Yes, she found the property comfortable. Pryor tried once more. We weren't aware that Callum had been. That is to say, it was quite a surprise to the town. Nora looked at her pleasantly. "I imagine it was," she said, and asked for the thread. Mrs. Pryor found herself somehow in possession of less information than she had started with, which had never happened to her before in 22 years of running the counter. Callum watched his wife move through the first week with the attention of a man who had lived alone long enough to notice everything that changed in a space. She reorganized nothing without cause and changed nothing without telling him, which was not what he had expected. His previous understanding of women in domestic situations, formed largely from watching other people's marriages at a distance, had suggested that reorganization would be immediate and largely non-negotiable. Instead, on the second morning, she had set a cup of coffee in front of him and said, "Your pantry is organized by size rather than frequency of use. I'd like to change that. Do you have any objection?" He had looked at her for a moment. "No," he had said. "Good," she had said, and sat down with her own cup and the list she apparently kept in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. She made lists. He noticed this early. Not anxious lists, the kind people make when they're managing worry, but clear, purposeful ones. The kind made by someone who had learned to trust her own assessments and wanted a record of them. She was also, he noticed, quiet in a way that was different from his quiet. His was the quiet of a man who had stopped expecting conversation to produce anything useful. Hers was the quiet of a woman who was listening to something he couldn't quite identify. One evening at the end of the first week, they were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table after supper, she with her notebook, he with nothing in particular, and he had said, without fully planning to, "You're not what I expected." She had looked up. "What did you expect?" He had thought about it honestly. "Someone more." He paused. "Provisional." She had held his gaze. "I don't do things provisionally," she said. "If I'm here, I'm here." He had looked at his hands, and then back at her, and felt something in the structure of his thinking shift slightly. The way weight redistributes when you move something from one side to the other. "All right," he had said. "All right," she had agreed, and gone back to her notebook. The town's opinion of Nora Greer, a name that still startled people when they heard it assembled that way, was divided along lines that roughly corresponded to whether or not people trusted what they couldn't immediately account for. Those who didn't trust it found her too self-contained, too composed. A woman who arrived with one bag and no explanations and declined to provide them afterward was either hiding something or above something. And neither possibility was entirely comfortable. Those who were more inclined toward reserve found her refreshing. Mrs. Hart, who fell firmly into the second camp, engineered a meeting at the dry goods counter in the second week by the simple method of being there when Nora arrived and introducing herself directly. "I'm Eleanor Hart," she had said. "I've known your husband for 11 years, and I am not going to pretend I wasn't curious about you." Nora had looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "That's the most honest thing anyone in this town has said to me since I arrived," she said. Mrs. Harday had laughed. "Sit down," she had said. "I'll buy you a coffee, and you can tell me whatever you feel like telling me, and I won't press you on the rest." Nora had sat down. She had told Mrs. Hart rather more than she had told anyone, which was still not a great deal, but it was offered rather than extracted, and that made all the difference. Afterward, Mrs. Harday had walked home in the October cold with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had formed an opinion on good evidence. She told her husband that evening that Nora Greer was going to be fine, and that the town would figure that out eventually, and that the only question was how long it would take people to stop being surprised by a woman who simply knew her own mind. The trouble came from a direction Nora had not been watching. His name was Renfield. He came to the property on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks in, arriving the way men arrive when they believe their arrival is expected and welcome, unhurried, proprietary, with the ease of long familiarity. He rode up the approach while Nora was on the porch with a book, and she watched him come with the still attention she gave to things she hadn't accounted for yet. He was well dressed for a working county. The kind of well-dressed that was meant to establish something. He reined in at the foot of the porch steps and looked her over with an open assessment that was not hostile, but was not particularly respectful either. "Didn't know Callum had acquired a wife," he said, with the faint emphasis on acquired that was meant to tell her something about how he saw the situation. "He didn't acquire one," Nora said pleasantly. "He married one. I'm here for Callum if you have business. Renfield's expression rearranged itself slightly. And I go back some years, he said. Old business. Then I'll get him, she said, and did not move from where she was sitting, which forced him to wait, which she suspected he was not accustomed to. Callum came out of the barn with the particular quality of stillness she had learned to read by now, not the everyday stillness of a man at rest, but the denser, more deliberate kind. He looked at Renfield the way you look at weather that has been threatening for some time. Renfield. Callum. The man's eyes moved to Nora and back. Didn't know you'd been busy. What do you want? Renfield smiled the way people smile when they're reminding you of something you'd rather forget. Just checking in. It's been a while. Thought I'd see how things were settling. Things are settled, Callum said. You've seen. Renfield held the smile one beat too long, then turned his horse without urgency and rode back down the approach. Callum stood watching until he was past the property line. Nora watched Callum. When he turned and came toward the porch, she said, "Who is he?" He stopped at the bottom of the steps. He was quiet for a moment in the way she had learned meant he was deciding something. "He worked for my father," he said finally. "Before my father died. There are things Renfield believes he's owed that he isn't." "What things?" He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to be part of this." "I'm already part of it," she said. "That's what signing the register means." He looked at her for a long moment with the careful, measuring attention she had catalogued carefully by now. Then he came up the porch steps and sat down in the other chair and told her. It came out over several evenings. The way things come out when someone has been carrying them alone long enough that the weight has become structural, slowly, in pieces, with pauses between that she learned to sit through without filling. His father had been a man who built things through arrangements that didn't always survive examination. Renfield had been part of those arrangements. When the property had passed to Callum, Renfield had arrived with the assumption that certain obligations had passed with it. Callum had disagreed. The disagreement had not been clean. There had been a night 4 years back that the town knew about in the vague and approximate way that towns know about things they weren't meant to witness. The details had been softened by retelling until what remained was a shape rather than a story. Something had happened. Someone had left. Callum Greer had gone back to his property the next morning and not discussed it. What had actually happened? Nora learned on a November evening with the fire burned low and the wind moving at the windows, was quieter and more complicated than the version the town had assembled. He had done what he had done to protect a family Renfield had been using to apply pressure. It had not been clean, he told her again. He was not proud of all of it. She listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting, without reframing it into something more manageable than it was. When he was done, she said, "You've been defending something that should never have needed defending." "It was mine to handle," he said. "It was," she agreed. "And now there's 2 of us." He looked at her across the fire. He had, she thought, the expression of a man who had prepared for a number of responses and not prepared for this one. "You didn't sign on for Renfield," he said. "I signed on for the property and whoever came with it," she said. "That includes past and present. I'm not interested in the version of this marriage where I get the quiet parts and you handle everything else alone." The fire settled. Outside, an owl called once and was quiet. Callum Greer looked at his wife for a long moment and felt something in his chest release from somewhere. It had been held for longer than he could accurately date. Renfield came back once more in December with 2 other men. Callum met them at the gate. Nora stood on the porch and watched. She had seen Callum in various kinds of stillness by now, his working stillness, his thinking stillness, the stillness of a man in the middle of a meal who has gone briefly somewhere inside himself. This was something different. This was the stillness of a man who had made a decision some time ago, and was simply confirming it. She couldn't hear the conversation from the porch. She didn't need to. She watched Renfield's face move through several positions, confidence, assessment, recalculation, and arrive somewhere that looked like a man who has looked at something carefully and concluded that the arithmetic no longer works in his favor. He turned his horse. His 2 men turned with him. They rode back down the road and did not look back. And Nora found herself exhaling something she had not realized she was holding. Callum walked back up the drive. He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. "Doan," he said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the open, unguarded expression of a man who is not, in this moment, holding anything at a distance. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He held the door for her. Winter settled over the property, with the particular finality of a northern winter that means business. They worked through it together, not in the tentative, negotiated way of the early weeks, but in the easy way of 2 people who have taken an accurate measure of each other and found it sufficient. The conversation between them had changed, not dramatically, but it had depth now where it had only functioned before. It went to places they had not agreed to go and stayed there without apology. She told him things about Belfield and the years before, offered without drama, simply the facts of her life laid out plainly. He received them the way he received most things she gave him, with full, quiet attention. He told her about the years he had spent trying to build something separate from what his father had made, to put enough distance between himself and those arrangements that the property could simply be a property. "And now," she said. "Now," he said. "It is." One evening in January, she fell asleep over a letter she was writing to her sister, the first real letter she had written since arriving. The kind that told the truth. She was aware, distantly, of the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of the wind outside, and then of nothing at all. She woke to find him sitting across from her with a book, not reading it, watching her with an expression he hadn't had time to arrange into anything particular. She blinked at him, still soft at the edges from sleep. "You should have woken me," she said. "You looked settled," he said. She looked at him for a moment in the warm kitchen with the fire going and the night outside doing what it liked. "Callum," she said. "Nora," he said, and there was something in the way they said each other's names, plainly, without performance. Like a door opening onto a room that had been there all along, that was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked directly. By spring, Sutter's Bend had largely amended its position, not loudly. The town was not given to loud corrections. Pryor mentioned to her husband that Nora Greer had a way of handling things that you didn't appreciate until you'd seen it applied to something difficult. The station master's wife, who had started everything, privately revised her original assessment in the direction of considerable respect. Mrs. Harte, who had been right from the beginning and knew it, said nothing about having been right. She invited Nora to the Tuesday reading group instead, and Nora came, and the conversation was good, and that was enough. The boy who had been sweeping outside the barber's shop on the Tuesday Nora arrived saw them come into town together one April morning. Callum with his habitual economy of movement, Nora beside him, saying something that made him look at her sidelong, and then forward again with the particular expression of a man trying to hold down a smile, and thought without fully articulating it that the thing he was watching made complete sense. Reverend Holt, who had been asked no questions and had offered no opinions, saw them at the April service and noted, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose business is long views, that Callum Greer was standing in the way of a man who had put down something heavy and had not, apparently, picked it back up. In the long light of an autumn afternoon, a year after the Tuesday train had arrived 40 minutes early, Nora Greer sat on the covered porch with the particular contentment of someone who has stopped being surprised by their own happiness and has decided to simply accept it as a condition of the place. The fields ran out before her in the gold of the season, worked and quiet and productive. From inside the house came the low sound of Callum's voice. He had developed a habit, in the evenings, of reading aloud from whatever he was working through at the time, not to her specifically, just into the room, and she had never mentioned that she liked it more than she knew how to say. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then the door, and then he was there in the doorway looking at the two of them, herself, and the small new person in her arms who had his eyes and her general air of having already taken the measure of things and found them acceptable. He sat down beside her without ceremony. She shifted toward him slightly, without thinking about it. He put his arm around her, without thinking about it. The land ran out before them in the autumn light, quiet and worked in theirs. Neither of them said anything. The thing about Sutter's Bend was that it had watched this story begin on a Tuesday morning, with a woman who stepped off a train with one bag and a paper in her pocket, and had thought it understood what it was seeing. It had taken the better part of a year for the town to understand that some arrivals are not what they appear to be, that some things that look like arrangements are something else entirely, assembled quietly, without announcement, out of honesty and proximity, and the particular trust that develops between two people who have decided, without making a production of it, to simply tell each other the truth, and that occasionally, not always, and not easily, but occasionally, that is enough to build something that holds.